The sound of lawnmowers filled the air as Susan surveyed her once pristine lawn, now coated in a toxic, neon blue sludge. Toxic dumping, she gasped, clutching the violation notice. Across the street, her neighbor glared, his pruning shears gleaming. The battle for the neighborhood had just begun. Susan's hands trembled as she read the bold-lettered notice from the city. Toxic dumping violation. Her pristine lawn, meticulously maintained for years, now lay ruined, covered in a noxious, electric blue sludge that seeped into the soil. Slamming the notice down on the kitchen counter, she stormed out the front door, eyes narrowed as she scanned the quiet suburban street. There, across the way, stood Mr. Wilkins, her perpetual nemesis on the Homeowners Association board, his pruning shears in hand as he glared back at her. "You did this," Susan shouted, marching across the street. "Your precious HOA dumped toxic waste on my lawn." Mr. Wilkins bristled, his face reddening. "I don't know what you're talking about, Susan. Perhaps if you paid more attention to proper lawn maintenance instead of letting it go to ruin." "Ruin?" Susan interrupted, her voice rising in pitch. "This is sabotage, plain and simple. You're trying to find me again, aren't you? Well, I won't stand for it." The older man's lips thinned to a tight line. "If you have a problem, take it up with the HOA. But I can assure you, we had nothing to do with this." He gestured dismissively at the blue-stained grass. Susan's jaw clenched, fury churning in her stomach. "We both know that's a lie. This is your doing, Wilkins, and I intend to prove it." Before he could respond, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Leaning against the entryway, she took a deep, shuddering breath, her mind racing. She had to act fast. The violation notice stated she had 48 hours to clean up the toxic spill or face hefty fines. But how could she prove Wilkins was behind it? The HOA had always played dirty, using petty rules and trumped-up charges to harass her, but this was a new low. Straightening, Susan hurried to her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as she researched local environmental regulations and HOA laws. If the city considered this a toxic dump, then the HOA would be liable for the cleanup costs, not her. A small, grim smile tugged at her lips. This was her chance to finally take them down, once and for all. Grabbing her phone, she scrolled through her contacts, pausing on the number for the local news station. With a deep breath, she pressed call, steel in her voice as she explained the situation. "You're telling me the HOA deliberately dumped toxic waste on your property," the reporter exclaimed. "And the city is trying to fine you for it." "That's right," Susan replied, glancing out the window at Wilkins, who was now pacing his front lawn, phone pressed to his ear. "I have proof that the HOA has a history of targeting me with trumped-up violations. This is just the latest in their campaign of harassment." The reporter's tone grew eager. "This sounds like a huge story. Can you send over any documentation you have? We'd love to send a crew out to cover this." Susan's smile widened. "Absolutely. I'll email everything over right away. And thank you. I'm counting on you to help me expose these crooks for what they are." Hanging up, she turned her attention back to her research, determination burning in her chest. The HOA was about to learn a hard lesson. You don't mess with Susan Parsons. The news crew arrived the next morning, cameras rolling as Susan described the blue sludge coating her lawn and the city's toxic dumping violation. By the time she finished, a small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered, murmuring amongst themselves. Mr. Wilkins emerged from his house, face pinched with displeasure as he approached the reporter. "This is highly irregular," he huffed. "The HOA had nothing to do with any toxic spill on Mrs. Parsons' property. I'm sure this is simply another one of her attempts to create drama and avoid her responsibilities." The reporter arched an eyebrow. "So you're saying the city is wrong about this being a toxic dump?" Wilkins hesitated, then said stiffly, "I'm simply stating that the HOA followed all proper procedures. If there's an issue, I'm sure it can be resolved amicably. Susan stepped forward, eyes narrowed. Amicably? You're the one who's been fining me for every minor infraction, trying to force me out of this neighborhood. Well, not this time, Wilkins. This time, I'm fighting back. The reporter turned to face her, microphone extended. Can you explain what you mean by that, Mrs. Parsons? Susan took a deep breath. For years, the HOA has been harassing me with bogus violations. My lawn was an inch too long, my garage door was the wrong color. They'd fined me thousands of dollars, all while letting other homeowners skate by with far worse infractions. She gestured at the blue-stained grass. And now this. They dumped toxic waste on my property, hoping I'd be forced to pay for the cleanup. But I've got proof that the HOA has a history of this kind of underhanded behavior. Wilkins opened his mouth to respond, but the reporter cut him off. Do you have any evidence to support these claims, Mrs. Parsons? As a matter of fact, I do. Susan turned and hurried back into her house, emerging moments later with a thick stack of documents. Here are copies of all the HOA violation notices and fines they've issued me over the years, along with records of the infractions they've ignored from other homeowners. The reporter leafed through the papers, brow furrowing. This does seem to paint a concerning picture. Mr. Wilkins, do you have a response to these allegations? Wilkins' face had gone beet red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This is an outrageous accusation, he spat. The HOA has always acted in the best interests of this community. Mrs. Parsons is simply trying to vilify us for her own gain. Oh, I'm not trying to vilify you, Wilkins, Susan said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm trying to expose you for the power-hungry tyrant you are. This community deserves better than your petty, vindictive rule. The reporter glanced between the two, sensing the rising tension. Well, it seems we have a bit of a standoff here. Mrs. Parsons, can you tell us what your next steps will be? Susan squared her shoulders, a steely glint in her eyes. I'm going to fight this violation tooth and nail. I'm going to prove that the HOA is responsible for the toxic spill, and I'm going to make sure they're held accountable for their actions. This ends today. As the reporter turned back to Wilkins for a final comment, Susan caught sight of her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, watching the confrontation from her porch. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Susan saw a flicker of understanding in the other woman's gaze. Perhaps she wasn't alone in this battle after all. The local news report on the toxic dumping incident spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, sparking outrage and heated discussions among the residents. Susan watched with a grim satisfaction as the HOA's dirty laundry was aired for all to see, her stack of evidence a damning indictment of their misdeeds. But as the days passed, the situation only seemed to escalate. Wilkins and the other HOA board members refused to back down, doubling down on their claims that Susan was the one at fault. They began issuing her a flurry of new violations, each one more petty and absurd than the last. Your lawn is a quarter-inch too long, Wilkins would sneer, handing her another hefty fine. And the trim on your front door is the wrong shade of white. It simply won't do. Susan gritted her teeth, her hands trembling with fury as she paid the fines under protest. But she refused to be cowed, redoubling her efforts to gather more evidence and build her case. One afternoon, as she was leaving her house, she noticed Mrs. Alvarez lingering on her own porch, eyes downcast. Impulsively, Susan crossed the street and approached her. Mrs. Alvarez, can I talk to you for a moment? The older woman looked up, startled. Oh, Mrs. Parsons. I wasn't expecting you. Susan offered her a small smile. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I was hoping you might be willing to help me with something. Mrs. Alvarez eyed her warily. What is it? I'm trying to build a case against the HOA for their harassment and the toxic spill on my lawn, Susan explained. I have a lot of evidence, but I could use some more. Have you or any of your neighbors experienced similar issues with the board? For a moment, Mrs. Alvarez was silent, her gaze flickering away. Then, with a heavy sigh, she nodded. Yes, actually. They've been giving me a hard time about the color of my front door for months now. Susan's eyes widened. The color of your door. But that's absurd. I know, Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice tinged with resignation. I've tried to fight it, but they just keep issuing me more and more fines. I haven't been able to afford the repairs they're demanding. Susan felt a pang of sympathy. Mrs. Alvarez, I had no idea. Would you be willing to share your records with me? Anything you have related to HOA violations or fines? The older woman hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I suppose so. Anything to take those bullies down a peg. A spark of determination flashed in her eyes. Thank you, Susan said, her heart swelling with renewed hope. I really appreciate your help. Together, we can expose the HOA's corruption and put an end to their reign of terror. As she hurried back to her house, Susan felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Mrs. Alvarez's support, she might just have a chance at winning this fight. But even as she prepared to take the battle to the HOA, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Wilkins and his cronies had something more sinister up their sleeves. They had already shown themselves to be ruthless and underhanded. What else might they be willing to do to protect their power? Susan shuddered, steeling herself for the fight ahead. Whatever came, she was determined to see this through to the end. The following week, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez pored over the stack of HOA violation notices and fines, carefully cataloging each incident. Their findings painted a damning picture of the board's abuse of power, with countless examples of residents being targeted for the most minor of infractions, while more egregious violations were swept under the rug. Look at this one, Mrs. Alvarez said, her brow furrowed. They fined Mrs. Hernandez for having a chipped mailbox, but they let the Smiths go for over a year with their lawn completely overgrown. Susan nodded grimly. It's exactly the kind of selective enforcement I've been dealing with. They're using these petty rules to harass and intimidate anyone who doesn't fall in line. As they continued delving into the paperwork, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Many of the residents who had been repeatedly targeted by the HOA were people of color or those from lower income backgrounds. This is discrimination, plain and simple, Susan said, her voice tinged with anger. They're using these violations to push out the families they don't want in this neighborhood. Mrs. Alvarez's expression darkened. I knew they were heavy-handed, but I never realized the extent of it. This is outrageous. Well, we're going to put a stop to it, Susan declared, her eyes blazing with determination. I'm taking this evidence to the local news, the city council, and anyone else who will listen. We're going to expose the HOA's dirty secrets and make them accountable for their actions. Over the next few days, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez worked tirelessly to compile their findings and reach out to local media outlets and government officials. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story of the HOA's abusive and discriminatory practices quickly gained national attention, sparking outrage and calls for reform. Meanwhile, the HOA board members only seemed to grow more desperate and combative. Wilkins and his allies began openly harassing Susan and Mrs. Alvarez, issuing them a barrage of new violations and even going so far as to threaten legal action. This is just another one of your attempts to vilify the HOA, Wilkins sneered at a tense community meeting. You're trying to turn the entire neighborhood against us, but we won't stand for it. We'll sue you both for slander and defamation if you don't back down. Susan stood her ground, her chin held high. We have the evidence, Wilkins. You can't bully us into silence. The truth is going to come out, no matter how hard you try to bury it. The room erupted into angry shouts and accusations, with the residents of the neighborhood firmly divided. Some rallied behind Susan and Mrs. Alvarez, while others remained loyal to the HOA board, convinced that the two women were simply troublemakers. As the meeting devolved into chaos, Susan caught sight of Mrs. Alvarez, her face etched with a mixture of fear and determination. In that moment, Susan knew they were in this fight together, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the din. "We won't be intimidated, Wilkins. We're going to keep fighting until the corruption in this HOA is exposed for all to see." The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. In the weeks that followed, the struggle between Susan, Mrs. Alvarez, and the HOA board only intensified. Wilkins and his allies continued to barrage the two women with violation notices and threats of legal action, but Susan and Mrs. Alvarez refused to back down. They held press conferences, rallied the support of community organizations, and even took their case to the city council, demanding an investigation into the HOA's discriminatory practices. The media coverage and public scrutiny only seemed to fuel the board's desperation, as they resorted to increasingly underhanded tactics to try and silence their critics. One afternoon, as Susan was returning home from a meeting with the city attorney, she found her front door covered in a thick, viscous liquid. The sickly sweet stench of chemicals made her gag, and she immediately recognized it as the same noxious sludge that had been dumped on her lawn. Fury coursed through her as she rushed inside to call the police, her hands shaking with rage. This was a clear act of retaliation, and she knew exactly who was behind it. When the officers arrived, they confirmed that the substance was indeed the same toxic material, and they immediately launched an investigation. Susan insisted that Wilkins and the HOA board were responsible, and the police promised to look into it. As the news of the vandalism spread through the neighborhood, Susan found herself the recipient of an outpouring of support from her fellow residents. Even those who had previously been skeptical of her crusade against the HOA now rallied to her side, disgusted by the board's latest act of aggression. Mrs. Alvarez was particularly incensed, her usually mild-mannered demeanor giving way to a fierce determination. "They've gone too far this time," she declared, her eyes blazing. "We're going to make them pay for this." Together, the two women redoubled their efforts, reaching out to local environmental groups and civil rights organizations to bolster their case. The pressure on the HOA board was mounting, and Susan could see the cracks beginning to show in their previously united front. Wilkins, in particular, was becoming increasingly unhinged, lashing out at anyone who dared to question the board's actions. During a tense community meeting, he even went so far as to accuse Susan and Mrs. Alvarez of orchestrating the toxic spill themselves in a desperate attempt to discredit them. But the residents refused to be swayed, their anger and distrust of the HOA board only growing stronger with each passing day. And when the local news station broke the story of the vandalism, complete with evidence of the toxic chemicals, the board's last shreds of credibility crumbled. Susan watched with a grim satisfaction as Wilkins and the other board members were forced to resign, their reputations and authority in tatters. The city quickly moved to take control of the HOA, promising sweeping reforms and a thorough investigation into the board's past misdeeds. As the dust settled, Susan turned to Mrs. Alvarez, a weary but triumphant smile on her face. "We did it," she said. "We finally took them down." Mrs. Alvarez nodded, her own expression softening. "Yes, we did. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning." Together, they knew that their fight for justice had only just begun. In the aftermath of the HOA board's downfall, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez found themselves at the forefront of a growing movement for community reform. With the city now in control of the Homeowners Association, they seized the opportunity to push for sweeping changes that would address the long-standing issues of discrimination and abuse. Alongside a coalition of concerned residents, they lobbied for the implementation of strict oversight measures, including regular audits and the establishment of an independent ethics board to handle resident complaints. They also demanded the adoption of clear, objective criteria for HOA violations and fines to prevent the kind of selective enforcement that had plagued the neighborhood for years. "This is about more than just our community," Susan said during a heated town hall meeting. "It's about ensuring that no other family has to go through what we've been through. the harassment, the intimidation, the blatant disregard for the well-being of our neighbors. We deserve better, and we're going to fight for it. The City Council, recognizing the groundswell of public support behind Susan and Mrs. Alvarez's efforts, quickly moved to enact the proposed reforms. Wilkins and the other former board members were barred from ever serving on the HOA again, and a new, more diverse leadership team was put in place to oversee the organization's operations. As the changes took hold, the neighborhood began to transform. Families who had previously lived in fear of the HOA's wrath now felt empowered to speak up and advocate for their rights. Residents from all backgrounds came together, united in their determination to create a more just and inclusive community. For Susan and Mrs. Alvarez, the victory was bittersweet. The scars of their long battle against the HOA would not heal overnight, and the trauma of the toxic dumping incident still lingered. But they took solace in the knowledge that their efforts had made a real, tangible difference, not just for their own families, but for generations to come. One day, as Susan was tending to her now thriving lawn, she spotted Mrs. Alvarez strolling by, a contented smile on her face. Impulsively, she waved the older woman over, and the two of them struck up a conversation. Their once rocky relationship now forged into a genuine friendship. Can you believe it? Mrs. Alvarez marveled, shaking her head in disbelief. All those years of living in fear, and now look at us, the ones who took down the HOA tyrants. Susan chuckled, a wistful expression crossing her features. No, I can hardly believe it myself. But I'm glad we had each other to lean on, every step of the way. Mrs. Alvarez reached out and squeezed Susan's hand, her eyes shining with warmth. Me too, my friend. Me too. As they stood there, basking in the afternoon sun, Susan couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude and accomplishment. The battle had been long and arduous, but in the end, they had emerged victorious, not just for themselves, but for the entire community they called home. And with that realization, Susan knew that the sacrifices had been worth it. This was a new chapter for their neighborhood, one defined by justice, equality, and the power of ordinary people to enact real, meaningful change. In the months that followed the HOA's downfall, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez found themselves thrust into the spotlight as symbols of the fight against community injustice. Their story, once a localized battle, had captured the imagination of the nation, inspiring others in similar situations to stand up and demand accountability. Invitations to speak at conferences and lead workshops on grassroots activism poured in, and the two women eagerly embraced the opportunity to share their experiences and inspire others. They traveled the country, sharing the lessons they had learned and the strategies they had employed to take down the corrupt HOA board. It wasn't easy, Susan would often tell the audiences, her voice tinged with a mixture of pride and solemnity. There were times when we felt utterly alone, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. But we never gave up, and we never lost sight of our goal, to create a community that works for everyone, not just the privileged few. Mrs. Alvarez would nod in agreement, her own story of perseverance and resilience resonating with the crowds. It's about more than just winning a single battle, she would say. It's about building a movement, a network of people who are willing to stand up and fight for what's right, no matter the cost. As their influence grew, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez began to see the ripple effects of their actions. Across the country, similar HOA reform efforts were taking root, with residents banding together to demand greater transparency, accountability, and representation within their community organizations. The momentum was palpable, and Susan and Mrs. Alvarez found themselves at the forefront of a growing national conversation about the need for systemic change in how homeowners associations are structured and operated. But even as they basked in the successes of their crusade, the two women remained vigilant, aware that the fight was far from over. Wilkins and his former HOA allies had retreated from the public eye, but they knew the disgraced board members would not give up without a fight. They're biding their time, waiting for the spotlight to fade. Susan confided to Mrs. Alvarez one evening, her brow furrowed with concern. "We can't let our guard down, not for a second. They'll be back, and they'll be out for revenge." Mrs. Alvarez's expression darkened. "I know. We have to stay one step ahead of them, keep the pressure on. We can't let them regain their foothold in this community, or any community, for that matter." The two women spent long hours strategizing, mapping out contingency plans, and reaching out to their growing network of allies. They knew that the battle was far from over, but they were more determined than ever to see it through to the end. As the sun set over the neighborhood, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez stood side by side, their gazes fixed on the horizon. The path ahead was uncertain, but they were ready to face whatever challenges came their way, together. "We've come so far," Susan murmured, a faint smile on her lips. "But I have a feeling this is just the beginning." Mrs. Alvarez reached out and squeezed her hand, her own expression mirroring Susan's determination. "Then let's make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." In the years that followed, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez's crusade against the corrupt HOA board continued to reverberate across the country, inspiring similar grassroots movements and catalyzing sweeping reforms in how homeowners associations were structured and regulated. Through their tireless advocacy and the relentless pressure they applied, they succeeded in pushing through a series of state and federal laws that significantly curbed the power of HOAs, mandating greater transparency, resident representation, and oversight mechanisms. The days of petty tyranny and unchecked abuse were slowly coming to an end. But even as they celebrated these hard-won victories, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez remained vigilant, aware that their former adversaries were still lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to regain their lost influence. And that opportunity eventually came, in the form of a new, seemingly innocuous HOA board election. In the months leading up to the vote, Wilkins and his allies quietly began to mobilize, leveraging their connections and resources to mount a coordinated campaign. They framed their bid for power as a return to traditional values and community stability, skillfully exploiting the fears and anxieties of the more conservative residents. Susan and Mrs. Alvarez, alerted to the looming threat, sprang into action, rallying their own network of supporters and launching a fierce counteroffensive. They held town halls, organized voter registration drives, and tirelessly canvassed the neighborhood, determined to prevent the former HOA tyrants from regaining control. The battle lines were drawn, and the entire community found itself caught in the crossfire, forced to choose sides in a proxy war for the soul of their neighborhood. As the election day drew near, the tension in the air was palpable, with both sides pulling out all the stops to secure victory. Susan and Mrs. Alvarez knew that the stakes could not be higher. If Wilkins and his cronies were to win, all of their hard-won progress would be undone, and the community would once again be subjected to the same abusive and discriminatory practices that had plagued it for years. On the day of the election, the residents of the neighborhood flooded the polling stations, their voices and votes serving as a resounding rejection of the former HOA board's misdeeds. When the final results were tallied, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez's slate of reform-minded candidates had won in a landslide, crushing Wilkins' attempt at a comeback. As the news spread, the two women embraced, tears of joy and relief streaming down their faces. They had won, not just a single battle, but an entire war for the soul of their community. In the aftermath, Susan and Mrs. Alvarez were hailed as heroes, their names synonymous with the fight for justice and the power of grassroots activism. They continued to lend their voices and expertise to similar efforts across the country, inspiring others to stand up and demand change. But for Susan and Mrs. Alvarez, the true victory lay in the transformed neighborhood they now called home, a place where all residents, regardless of their background or means, could feel safe, respected, and empowered to shape their shared future. As they gazed out over the vibrant, thriving community, they knew that their long and arduous struggle had been worth it. This was their legacy, a testament to the power of determination, resilience, and the unwavering belief that together they could make a difference.